Welcome back to our channel, and today's topic is all about the liberation of the Philippines during 1945. Almost 76 years ago, Japan officially surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. The 23-minute ceremony ended the Pacific War, which had started December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed. It also ended nearly 4 bitter years for Japanese occupation in the Philippines, a war that shattered the Pearl of the Orient and killed approximately 1 million civilians. But today, not many people know the tremendous sacrifices of the Filipinos during the World War II. President Theodore Roosevelt Franklin told the Filipinos on December 28, 1941, "In this great struggle of the Pacific, the loyal Americans of the Philippine Islands are called upon to play a crucial role. The people of the United States will never forget what the people of the Philippine Island are doing this day and in the days to come. I give to the people of the Philippines my solemn pledge that their freedom will be redeemed. The entire resources in the men and material of the United States stand behind the pledge." At the same time, the Arcadia Conference was taking place in the Washington, D.C. Winston Churchill had crossed the Atlantic to ensure that the United States would fulfill the terms of Rainbow Plan 5, the Allied War Plan developed during the American, British, Dutch, Australian conversation from January to April 1941, based on the Europe policy, prioritizing American military resources to win the war against Hitler, before that against Japan. The U.S. Army forces in the Far East, called the USAFE, created on July 26, 1941, consisted of about 100,000 Filipinos and 20,000 American soldiers. Their main task was to perform a delaying action on the mouth of the Manila Bay. Not a month had passed after Japanese invasion of the Philippines on December 8 before these troops were placed on half rations. Despite promises by their commanding General Douglas MacArthur that thousands of troops and hundreds of planes were being dispatched, no help ever came. These are the picture of the U.S. and Filipino soldiers that surrendered on Corregidor in 1942. The majority troops were suffering from disease and starvation when they surrendered. On April 9, 1942, they were forced to walk on their prison camp some 65 miles away under extreme tropical conditions with no provision for food, water, shelter, or medicine. Those who could no longer go on were beaten, bayoneted, shot, and even beheaded by their Japanese captors. Thousands died in what became known as the infamous Bataan Death March. In one case, a group of 350 soldiers who just surrendered were herded to a river and massacred. But despite the agony of defeat, the USAFE soldiers delayed the Japanese Army 50-day timetable by holding on to the Bataan Peninsula for 99 days. This is the picture of the death march of American and Filipino soldiers from Bataan going to Tarlac. Pictures courtesy of National Archives. Although Japan granted the Philippines its independence in 1943 as part of its Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere program, the Filipinos suffered greatly from atrocities inflicted not only on suspected guerrillas but on many innocent civilians. Torture, rape, pillage, and massacres sometimes of the entire village. took place all over the country. The Kimpitai, or the Japanese military police, used the method of zonification, rounding up suspected insurgents with the help of Filipino collaborators called the Makapilis to help identify them. It was the same system that was used during the occupation of Manchuria and more frequently during the Second Sino-Japanese War. When liberation started on October 20, 1944, zonification was used with more frequency and impunity. When the U.S. First Cavalry arrived in Manila on February 3, 1945, it proceeded to Santo Tomas University north of the Pasig River, where 3,785 Allied civilian prisoners of war had been kept for over 3 years. While the American troops were met on the streets by jubilant civilians, what happened next, south of the river where the Japanese soldiers were entrenched, was the systematic slaughter of men, women, and children. This battle became one of the largest urban struggles during the World War II, resulting in the indiscriminate deaths of 100,000 people. Here in this picture, Pedro Serrano, a Filipino man, with the remains of victims murdered by the Japanese. In Los Baños, in the neighboring province of Laguna, elements of the U.S. 11th Airborne, in tandem with many Filipino guerrillas, rescued 2,132 Allied civilians. That's Allied civilian prisoners on February 23, 1945. That very same night, after the rescuers departed, the Japanese soldiers slaughtered approximately 1,500 civilians. The same scenario occurred throughout the country. Ruins of the church destroyed in Dulag, Leyte in 1944. It was not until June 14, 1945 that the guerrillas of the U.S. Army Forces in the Philippines, north of Luzon, USA 5th INL, were able to plant their hastily improvised flag on the steep ridge near Besang Pass in northern Luzon. They led the intense 4-month battle for the pass, supported by elements of the U.S. 6th Army 33rd Division, 5th U.S. Air Force Marine Aircraft Group 24, even then General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of the Japanese 14th Army in the Philippines, who had earned the moniker the Tiger of Malaya for his swift conquest of Malaya and Singapore, did not surrender until September 2, 1945. Filipino troops had made up 7/8 of the main line of resistance during the Battle of the Bataan. The U.S. 6th and 8th Armies employed thousands of Filipinos during the liberation of the Philippines. Most of the fighting and the dying were done by the Filipinos, but on February 18, 1946, the U.S. Congress passed the first Supplemental Surplus Appropriation Rescission Act, in that act included a rider that deemed the service of the Filipinos during the World War II as not active, thereby excluding them from claiming veterans' benefits. Through the years, health benefits, citizenship, and a one-time compensation were slowly given to the veterans, but only very few small fraction were able to avail. In 2016, Congress passed PL 114-265, which awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Filipino veterans, but the 1946 Rescission Act was never repealed. The toll of the war of the World War II has transcended several generations, but in order to understand its ramification, its lessons must be taught to the younger generation who will become the leader of tomorrow, so they can understand the great sacrifices that were made by the 15 million soldiers and 45 million civilians who died and 25 million wounded. It is incumbent upon us to do so if we are serious about protecting our children from the horrors of the future wars. That's it for today, folks. Thank you so much for viewing the video, and don't forget to subscribe and make a comment. And the comment is your attendance for our classes. And don't go away, there will be questions posted at the end of this video. Thank you. Okay, class, here are the questions for you to answer. It will be submitted, your answered paper will be submitted right here in our Google Classroom. Hand it in or send it to our email. Okay, and don't forget to make a lot of comment on every video that I posted, because your comment will serve as your attendance. Now let's go to the questions. Number 1, how did World War II affect the Philippines? What happened to the Philippines after the war? What happened to the Philippines after World War II? What is post-war period in the Philippines? Why was Manila declared an open city? How many years is martial law in the Philippines? When did the US give Philippines back? What was the longest revolt in the Philippines? Why did the Philippines rebel against the US? Well, that's all for today, folks. Thank you so much. Ciao.